Good evening. This is Dr. Mark Andrew Holowchak. A lot of you know me as a Jeffersonian scholar, but today I want to talk to you about another large interest that I have, and that is on Ukraine history and Ukrainian culture. I've published a few books on Ukraine already, and I just finished a large, nearly 800-page book on history of Ukraine titled "Ukraine: The Deep Roots of a Young Nation." And toward the end of the book, I have some thoughts on um, possibility of the end of the Ukrainian war. I watch a lot of videos on YouTube, and there are many excellent videos by many excellent and well-qualified people. But I think oftentimes people, when they assess what's going on in the war, make numerous mistakes. And I think a lot of these mistakes can be forfended if one gets to know the players involved. So today I want to talk about the possibilities of Donald Trump as president of the incoming president of the United States, of really being able to negotiate for peace, and to what extent he'll be able to do that. So I want to say the title of this is Putin's Trump Card Trump? And I want to explore the possibility of an end to the war and the implications for Ukraine in years to come by talking about Trump and talking about Putin and a little bit about Zelensky. Now, Zelensky, just after the special military operation on February 24, right, 2022, mentioned that Ukraine was always a sort of European gray zone. And I like that metaphor. So it's the gray zone in which Moscow thinks they're allowed to do anything, even commit the most horrific war crimes. I like the metaphor of gray zone because I think it neatly captures Ukraine's geopolitical position in history. It's always been, for geographic considerations, a gray zone. I think the metaphor is wonderful, but I think it's regrettably underdeveloped by Zelensky. I think perhaps the notion of a no man's land is probably, with all of its polysemy, probably captures the situation better, right? Now, Ukrainians have always been in this gray zone to which Zelensky refers. And for one, that is why the Zaporozhian Cossacks established their Sikh on Little Khortytsia Island in the Dnipro River in 1552. That's also why Bohdan Khmelnytsky turned to Russia in 1654 for the Pereyaslav Treaty, right? He had treaties in the past, numerous treaties the Cossacks did with Poland, Lithuania. They had treaties, and all those treaties were obliterated by Polish people when the time was right, by the kings and the Polish magnates when the time was appropriate. So Poland, Lithuania proved to be a not so trustworthy partner. Khmelnytsky turned to Russia because the Tartars and the Turks, 3 times on 3 occasions, violated right in the middle of a war with Poland, Lithuania. The Turkish people bolted. Tartar Turks bolted, and namely, they were also pagans and not Orthodox, not Christians, and so the Ukrainian people did not cotton to a lengthy any kind of treaty with the Turks and so forth. And the Turks also were lovers of hoarding slaves, and they would hoard slaves by the tens of thousands, sometimes even hundreds of thousands, to be sold on markets and so forth. So Khmelnytsky in 1654 turns to the Russians, right? And Zelensky, not Zelensky, but Putin makes much of that this was sort of a willful treaty, and this was a sign that the wayward Ukrainians understood that they really were Russians all along, and they embraced the Tsar at the time. This is also why the Ukrainian Republic, the UNR, and the Western Ukrainian National Republic, the ZUNR, had failed, even though they came together in 1918, 1990. This was a partnership that was doomed to fail because the UNR was pretty much at odds with Russia, fighting with Russians and so forth. And the ZUNR, Western Ukraine, was fighting Poland at the time, so they couldn't The armies couldn't coalesce. So the idea is that Ukraine just being an entity, even though its borders have shifted over time, but it's an entity that's literally, in a no man's land, as it were. Um, and it's going to always require partnership with other entities because it's situated Poland in Eastern Europe on the one hand, in Russia on the other hand, to the east and to the north, right? So and then the land is relatively flat and grassy, very cold in the wintertime and very hot in the summertime. It's not easily defended. Okay, so what does the future hold for Ukraine? I think, since the war has begun in February 24, 2022, I think that can only be answered by looking at Russia's strategy and Ukraine's strategy during the war. Now, right off the bat, this was called by Putin a special military operation. And Russians always have a history of glossing over things, right? Uh, of, uh, of eulogizing, as it were, and giving things in roseate terms. Now, why do you call it a special military operation? I think he was sincere because it was supposed to be something that would happen over just a few days, maybe at worst a couple of weeks. The great Russian bear, the Russian army would go in and just obliterate Ukraine. Zelensky would give up and say, the Russian army is too powerful. And the Ukrainian people, too, would be welcomed in Ukraine as liberators. Putin's rhetoric also, inflammatory rhetoric, also calls the Ukrainians, many of the Ukrainians, neo-Nazis. At one point, he calls them drug addicts and neo-Nazis and calls them a drug addict. He's referring to Zelensky because Zelensky was accused of having a drug problem when he ran for president, right? Anyway, so the Russian strategy during the war has been to wear down Ukrainian forces with an unrelenting and heavy assault. They don't care about casualties. They have lost perhaps some 800,000 men during the war, and they replaced them with new forces and new men. You know, number one. Number two is to attack repeatedly Ukraine's energy sector in Kiev and other main cities, and hopefully that will break down the morale of Ukrainians and force them to surrender. And three, part of what I mentioned, the second one, is ultimately break the will of Ukraine and the will of the West to act as a functional unit in terms of helping Ukraine monetarily as well as with weapons to fight the war. So there's a threefold strategy for Russia: break the will of the West, wear down Ukrainian forces with just enormously large amount of troops, and then attack the energy sector. Now, the Ukrainian strategy, of course, has been to forfend the Russian assault, number one, through endurance. The number two, to reclaim, whenever possible, lost territories. And three, to lobby for and keep a unitary West and the United States behind Ukraine in its fight with Russia. So, we have this situation. Now, everything changed with the 2024 United States presidential election. Trump campaigned rather loudly, as he always does. He does everything loudly with the promise to end the war in one day. He said that on several occasions prior to winning the presidency. On one time, he says, before I even arrive at the Oval Office, shortly after we win the presidency, I will have the terrible war, the horrible war between Russia and Ukraine settled, and we will restore peace through strength. Now, this whole notion of peace through strength is pivotal for Trump. He is a president who believes in being a strong military power. That's what Putin believes as well. Now, Trump, of course, we know would recant on December 17, 2024. He waffles. He says, I might. Can I end it 24 days? I might. I'm going to try. On January 5, 2025, the message through Kellogg, right? His ambassador is that the war will end during the first 100 days of Trump's presidency. Why 100? 100 is just a sort of number that all presidents have adopted as a convenient number to show to the public that they've made some difference in carrying out their presidential promises and so forth. The problem with Trump is he is an unrestrainable narcissist, right? Um, I've never been a fan of Donald Trump. He doesn't really matter because he loves himself enough for all Americans, right? Uh, an example of his unrestrained narcissism is with the death of President Jimmy Carter and the current President Biden's insistence that all flags, American flags, should be at half mast for 30 days. Trump was incensed, right? Doesn't care about Carter. He says they think it's so great. The Democrats, they're happy about it because in actuality, they don't love our country. They only think about themselves, right? Who's thinking about whom here? Trump doesn't care at all about Jimmy Carter or his legacy or honoring the person. I have a great deal of respect for Jimmy Carter. He's only worried about not having flags at half mast while he takes over the office. If there's a greater instance of his narcissism and his love of self, I don't know that there is. Show me, but yeah. All right. So we also know that Trump was impeached, and the impeachment was centered on Hunter Biden's activities in a Ukrainian energy company. In the impeachment proceedings and the record, Trump calls Zelensky, and Zelensky doesn't want to get involved in this matter, but Trump is dangling some like $400 million in military support to Zelensky, and that's iffy. He wants Zelensky to do him a favor. He says there's a lot of talk about Biden's son, that Biden stopped the prosecution, and a lot of people want to find out about that. So whatever you can do with the attorney general would be great. President Zelensky does not want to get involved in this at all, does not want to make this a tit for tat. He's interested in American aid, but doesn't want to get involved in the sort of political squabbles here that Trump wants him to involve himself, right? Trump delays aid, delays the military support for Zelensky, only sends it when the news comes out that there's a whistleblower about, what Trump has been trying to do. Now, Trump is not a friend, never been a friend of NATO. He's always been highly critical, and he's talked in the past of the United States leaving NATO. He says they take advantage of us on trade, meaning the European nations. They don't take our cars. They don't take our food products. They don't take anything. It's a disgrace. On top of that, we defend them, so it's a double whammy, right? The idea is he'll stay with NATO, but NATO has to pay, equally as well. They have to reciprocate and help out America. And I'm fine with that. I sort of understand that. It's that, America has been the predominant influence in NATO, and Trump is merely asking other countries of NATO to step up to the plate. Vis-a-vis Ukraine, he wants Germany and he wants France to do their fair share needing to be measured by the GDP. Okay, and at one point when a member of a NATO country, a large NATO country, asked Trump about American protection, American interest in war in Ukraine, he goes, no, I would not protect you. In fact, I would encourage them to do whatever the hell they want. You got to pay your bills. Now, what does Trump say about Ukraine? Right? He has gone out and said, it's been silly of America to send so much military assistance to Ukraine. Right? We shouldn't give anything. And in fact, I have a Ukrainian flag flying, and I've had one guy in a Jeep drive by, a young fellow, and yelling out to me, fuck you and fuck Ukraine, right? And at one point, I was outraged as well because this young punk doesn't know enough about what's going on in the war, going on in the world. I invited him to come up and talk to me about this. And all he did is he shouted that, of course, you're not going to be voting for Trump, right? So, Trump's resistance to sending money and military assistance to Ukraine is known by all. Now, I think the situation is changing with Trump. He's modifying his views. He's growing up. He's starting to understand a little more about the very, very long history of Ukraine and Russia, that we need to really come to understand the players quite a bit. Now, Putin has long schemed to take Ukraine, and then the plan is to take Belarus, and then presumably the rest of the countries that formerly belonged to the USSR, right? He has a track record of, he's a person with whom you can't negotiate because he's not going to honor any treaty in which he is involved. How do we know that? Well, look at the Minsk agreements. You know, the two agreements, and he has violated both, right? We're supposed to have a settlement from the 2014 war, or quasi-war, whatever you want to call it, in eastern Ukraine, and Russia just kept continuing on with its war efforts there, right? He has also violated the Geneva dictate to protect innocents in time of war. Look at all the innocent Ukrainians that were killed throughout bombing many of Ukrainian towns and cities. Doesn't care about that. Also, his broken promises, especially economic promises to the Russian people. So, on the one hand, we have to see that no compromise is possible for a person like Putin, right? You can only deal with him by force. When we get to the negotiating tables, he has to be shown that he is not in a strong bargaining position. Now, a lot of the comments and commentators always talk about Putin's superior bargaining position. I'm going to show that there is no superior position. He is in a very weak position, especially economically and with respect to his military assets. That doesn't mean that Ukraine is in a strong bargaining position. But the whole notion that Ukraine needs to come to the table on its knees is ridiculous. I think it's Putin. And I think Trump, as much as I dislike the man, I think Trump will actually make Putin come to the bargaining table a little bit on his knees. He does not know. I think he's afraid of Trump. He does not know what Trump's going to do. Now, so the point is with Trump being the new president, things are changed, right? The Russian UN ambassador, Gennady Gatilov, even stated Trump promised to settle the Ukrainian crisis overnight. Okay, let him try. We are realistic people, of course, slapping Trump in the face. We understand that this will never happen, but if he starts or suggests something to start the political process, it's welcome, right? So Trump has really done his share, I think, to let it be known that we need to come to the negotiating table and solve this problem, because there are hundreds of thousands of lives at stake. Putin has shown he doesn't care about his own troops going to war and losing. Korea and North Korean people as well. Now, 2 days prior to his special military operation, Trump was on the Clay Travis and Buck Sexton show. And he was asked about, Russia's encroachment in the Donbass, in the Donetsk and Luhansk oblasts in Ukraine. Talking about, and he says somewhat pejoratively or somewhat tongue-in-cheek, he goes, I went in yesterday, there was a television screen, says Trump, and I said, talking about what Putin's doing, this is genius. Putin declares a big portion of the Ukraine. Here we're talking about Donetsk and Luhansk. They were declared as republics by Putin. He had no right to do that because they're not nations, they're oblasts. He declares it as independent. Oh, that's wonderful, says Trump. Now, Putin is saying it's independent, a large section of Ukraine. I said, how smart is that? He's going to go in and be a peacekeeper. That's strongest peace force. That's the strongest peace force. We could use that on our southern border. So he's basically, speaking tongue in cheek here. And it's always difficult to know what Trump is saying because he's sometimes speaking sarcastically. He always, whenever he's interviewed or asked a question, goes off on numerous tangents. And if he's asked a question on something he doesn't about which he doesn't care to talk. He'll go to the things that he likes about which he wants to talk. That's what he does all the time, right? Um, Trump has always had a tremendous amount of respect for Putin. Trump likes strong people. He liked the Queen when he met the Queen before she passed. He liked the Pope when he met the Pope. He was not shy about saying he liked Putin. He always brags about understanding Putin. Uh, and I think that's quite clear that he does understand because they're made from the same cloth. They are two arrogant, narcissistic, imperialist autocrats. And Trump would, all this talk about Greenland and the Panama Canal today. Hard to know whether he's speaking sincerely. I think he is. But it also might be, and people don't talk about this just might be bargaining leverage when he comes to speak with Putin as well. To say as if, you want to consider yourself an imperialist, some land grabbing imperialist. I am too, so you better watch out for me. I don't know that that's what's going on, but that needs to be considered. Now, Putin was named, we know, in January 2025, December 12, 2024. Time named him Person of the Year, and they did a mandatory interview with him. And of course, at the beginning of the interview, he said, when he's talking about the Donbass, talks about the war, first thing he always says, it never would have happened if I were president, never have happened. Now, he repeats that all the time. He's got to get that first person singular pronoun in I. If I were president, when I'm president, I. Right? Now, he was asked, would he abandon Ukraine? Because he's got this history of not wanting to send money or missiles that could be used, or military assistance that could be used for other purposes instead of killing. And he, in the interview, he doesn't answer the question. And then the interviewer again asks him the same question because he doesn't answer. And he at least admits he's not going to bail on Ukraine. Now, what does that mean? I don't know. But he's going to at least, what seems to be happening here is Trump is acquainting himself much more intimately with the details of the history of Ukraine and Russia. He's coming to study, I think, Putin a little bit more sincerely. And he's coming to realize that Putin is not someone who wants to negotiate. Putin thinks those lands of Ukraine and eastern Ukraine, Crimea and southern Ukraine, the Oblast, the four oblasts from eastern and southern Ukraine, as well as Crimea, literally are Russians. They never should have. Those who gave away Crimea in 1954 were drunk. Must have been drunk, right, to give it away. So Putin says that, and because it never should have been given away, it's really properly still Russia. So they go in 2014 and attack Crimea and take it, right? To understand Putin, one needs to understand that he's got, and he wrote, during the COVID years, this false history of Ukraine and Russia being one. It goes all the way back to Kiev Rus, back in the 800s AD, where there was a large polity of many different tribes. And as Putin describes the story, tells the story, they all spoke an early form of Russian. Well, was that true? Now, there are many different dialects there. There was the influence of Tatars, of other wild tribes, nomadic tribes. There was the influence of Scandinavian peoples, Varangians, if you want, influence of other Slavic people to the west, and so forth. So there are a large number of people, different dialects. His whole notion of the history, he thinks, well, that was really, they spoke Russian, they were all Orthodox, and at times Kiev Rus did become Orthodox under Prince Vladimir. But the unity of this polity, he thinks, was strong. It never was strong. And even though it was pretty much under the control of the Grand Prince of Kiev at the time, the Grand Prince didn't have overwhelming sway and didn't have overwhelming authority over all the various princes, and there were all sorts of infighting. But his notion of this being a proto or early Russian state in Kiev, right? And as he tells the story, basically wants to say all of Ukraine really is Russian. So he has a right to take over all of Ukraine. That's what he wants to do all the while, right? For historical reasons. And one has to understand as well, he admires his great hero is Peter the Great, number one. He also loved Catherine too, right? After Peter, all people. He loved Ivan III, Ivan the Terrible, Ivan IV, right? And he has great admiration for Joseph Stalin. He's not a large friend over the USSR because he's into Russian imperialism and the greatness of Russia, right? But he respects what he says. You can say what you want about Stalin, but we won the war because of him, right? World War I. Putin conveniently fails to mention that there was a pact worked up between Hitler and Stalin later, which was non-aggression and so forth. He conveniently fails to mention that pact when we get to World War II. Conveniently fails to talk about that how not Russia, but how Germany invaded Russia at the time and forced Russia into the wall and forced Russia to abandon the non-aggressive pact between the two countries, right? So, anyways, Trump comes in. He puts together a proposal, a rough proposal, and we know that indirectly, where Ukrainian interest has always been to become a member of NATO. He says, okay, we're going to defer that for some 20 years, right? Yeah, we promised you, and Western nations always promised Ukraine, right, to going back prior to Putin in the 1990s when Ukraine became a nation in 1991. What we had is Ukraine handing over. The first Ukrainian president hands over all of the nuclear weapons to Russia, and they sign a pact that should anything happen to Ukraine, Russia will assist Ukraine, the United States will assist Ukraine, and England will assist Ukraine. Well, Putin comes in 2014 and he takes Crimea, he takes the Donbass, he goes into the Donbass. Did the United States help out Ukraine? Did England help out Ukraine? No, they did not, right? So they broke those promises. So, the plan involves NATO membership in 20 years, a delay, and acceptance of the lands that Russia now occupies. These will become a certain DMZ zone to be patrolled by British or European, perhaps NATO troops and so forth, right? The idea being that we'll acknowledge that Russia, in some sense, occupies this land, but it doesn't really belong to them. It doesn't really belong to Ukraine. I think the idea is, in Trump's mind, we'll stall for time, right? Ukraine has a right to those lands, and those are really Ukrainian lands. And Putin's plan all along has been to say that no, these are Ukrainian Nazis that are taking and have been genocidal vis-a-vis with respect to the Russophones. All the people who speak Russia in those areas have been treated with genocidally, has been discriminated against and so forth. And it's really quite a ridiculous claim because it's about every person throughout Ukraine speaks Russian and Ukrainian, right? So you're accusing Russian people of people who speak Russian, the Russian culture. Look, Zelensky himself didn't know well Ukrainian when he became president, had to learn the language much better before he declared it the national language of Ukraine. Other prominent Ukrainian leaders had to brush up on Ukrainian because, in the cities, Russia was the language of commerce, was the language of politics for the longest time, right? So, you know, given this two-pronged plan, Sergei Lavrov, Russia's foreign minister, rejects it. Says, judging by numerous leaks and Donald Trump's own interview with Time magazine on December 12th, he's talking about freezing hostilities on the line of engagement and transferring further responsibility for confronting Russia to Europeans. And he goes, this will not do. Again, Ukraine is not willing to compromise. Zelensky, too, Ukraine's president's not willing to compromise. You're going to, in effect, I understand it perfectly well. To give in anything to Putin is to reward a criminal for their criminality, right? So enter Trump. Trump he's between a rock and a hard place, to use that overused metaphor. With Trump entering the picture, there is, it seems, possibility, at least, of conciliation, of some sort of concessions made to Putin, some concessions made to Zelensky. So that's what Trump brings to the table. He also brings to the table an ego that is probably larger and more unpredictable than Putin's ego, right? Trump thinks of himself as a great man as well. I should say something about Putin's Napoleon complex. Like Stalin, Stalin was, I think, 5'6", and he had a webbed foot. He had deformed arm and so forth. He was unprepossessing, not very handsome. And he certainly made up for his shortness through politics of power. Same with Putin, who's, again, 5'6" and maybe weighing at most about 150 pounds. And his hero, strangely enough, is Peter the Great, who by some people think he was as tall as 6'8", right? But Putin sees himself as a great leader. That needs to be understood before we want to understand why he wants Ukraine. It's historically little Russia, really is part of Russia. He thinks it's not. So it belongs to us, and he also sees himself as a great military conqueror. That needs to be understood. So where are we going? Where are we at? Now, as I said, we need to talk of bargaining position. Everybody talks about Russia's great bargaining position, right? Because it has encroached on Ukrainian lands. And as Ukraine moves into the Kursk region of Russia, really hasn't done much damage there. It's been able to fend off the Russians that are attacking and the North Koreans who are getting slaughtered by the thousands over there. But all things considered, it hasn't done more than take a tiny parcel of land from Russia, which is the equivalent maybe of Rhode Island or a little bit more than that. So it hasn't done much damage. As a diversionary maneuver, is it doing much? Probably not. And a lot of people think, well, Ukraine did that because when Trump becomes president, we go to the bargaining table. The notion would be, well, if you're going to take, the southern and eastern lands of Ukraine, some 20% of Ukraine, we're going to take the Kursk Oblast, so forth. That seems to me to be a really pathetically bad argument because Russia would be gaining tremendously. I don't really think the argument from bargaining position makes a lot of sense. I think, Ukraine is just, going into Kursk as a diversion, seeing what can be done there. I don't think it's been a horribly successful maneuver, all things considered, by Ukraine using its troops and its military equipment into the region, and hasn't really done much. But they are at least keeping North Koreans at bay. The North Koreans were brought in to presumably take care of that problem. They haven't done, right? Now, what Putin's war has done, it's done to Russia, and it's done irreparable damage. Russia is merely too large to be self-sustaining and autocratic, right? When the eastern parts of Russia become more developed, they're going to break away from the sovereign Russian nation, right? Like the nations of Europe have done over time and so forth. Um, Autocracy too is out of vogue. The world has just become too small for one autocrat to be ruling over 1/6 of all the land on the planet, right? Globalization has made economic interdependency such a big issue so that, and this is China's problem, is that, Russia starts this war and it's affecting the Chinese government. It's affecting global economic situation everywhere. Food that can be sent to countries that need Ukrainian grain and so forth. Russian gas and oil that could be sent to countries that need it. There could be cooperation instead of tension. Putin does not want that to happen. He sees the West and capitalism, so forth, as a threat to Russia. That's what he sees. And I don't know what he sees, but he is power hungry. He is a titanolatrist, right? Now, let's look at the monetary reserves for sustaining war. They're dwindling, right? They had a couple hundred billion, if not more, to sustain and engage in the war. Now they're down to what, some $50 billion. First, so we have several problems. One, there's unwillingness of past economic partners to continue partnering. China is showing an unwillingness to really help Ukraine. There has been economic interdependency on Russian gas, right, by China. That's dangerous both for China and dangerous for Russia. But China is not looking upon Russia anymore as an equal partner. Russia is an inferior partner. Number two, there's inflation. Some critics argue that inflation in Russia is up to 30%, though the official Russian claim that it's something like 9% is ridiculous. When you interview people in the Russian streets and talk about, purchasing power, the average Russian is making just over $200 a month and is trying to live on that with inflation. Now, the Russian inflation rate is sort of corralled, as it were, by interest rates being capped at 21%. Putin might interfere with that, but if he does, there'll be runaway inflation, right? So the economy, at least presently, is relatively stable, but the average Russian is suffering mightily, making so little money, and with prices, grocery prices, and all sorts of prices going up all time. Now, the people who work in the factories that are making military equipment, tanks, and so forth, are making a better wage than the average Russian. Officials of the party are certainly doing well. And whatever Russia spends, obviously, people like Putin are doing well. He's a multi-billionaire. So that's, a problem. The economy is really, there are infrastructural problems that it's not dealing with. It's spending all of its money or most of its money on maintaining the war. It's not taking care of building roads, fixing houses that need, reworking and so forth, ensuring the well-being of citizens, that there's enough and good quality of foodstuffs. Putin's not concerned with any of that. We need to win this war. There are numerous foreign sanctions which limit foreign commerce, thereby prohibiting the importation of needed goods, things like microchips for computers that are needed in military equipment. There's been a freeze on Russian assets. Another problem, there's brain drain. Many of the finest minds of Russia have left because of the war. Scientists, scholars, teachers, politicians have left. Putin, not horribly unlike Stalin, is happy with quashing dissent by killing people. People mysteriously get thrown out of windows or fall out of windows if they voice any sort of discontent with what Putin's been doing. They're given 10-year prison terms for voicing discontent. People, when the war started, who just held up signs with nothing on them were thrown into prisons, right? Anyway, so there are fewer and fewer resources for the continuancy of the war. Soldiers, some 400,000 soldiers alone in 2024 have died in the military effort. What Putin likes to do, it is shock and awe. He's going to send in just tons of soldiers into the battle. They're poorly fed, poorly equipped. The tanks that they have, they're losing military equipment at an alarming rate. They're losing soldiers at an alarming rate. They've been able to increase. They're losing over 1,000 soldiers a day, which is enormous. They've been able to replace them for the time being, but of course that can't be done. The economy's struggling right now. There aren't enough people to fight the war. There aren't enough people in the factories, right? Okay, so that leads to another point, the decrease in the pool of labors in the factory, right? And thus, consequently, is there the availability, the ability, I should say, to produce the sort of military equipment that they need. Russia, we know, is using tanks that are sometimes 60 years old in the war, right? So the factories aren't doing it. Again, there are too few allies sympathetic to Putin's war, right? He counted when he went into Ukraine on Ukrainians embracing him as a liberator. He counted just like when he went into the Donbass, when he went into Crimea in 2014, as Europe not doing anything about it. Europe sitting back and saying, "Oh, this is a very bad thing you've done. You've invaded Ukraine and you're taking over Ukraine. You're bombing innocent civilians. That is very bad, Vladimir Putin. You know, we're going to tell you that, but we're not going to do anything." Europe has come together and has stayed together. Putin did not account on that, right? As it turns out, there aren't enough suitable and genuine military alliances, so he goes to the schizophrenic Kim Jong-un of North Korea, who sent in some 12,000 soldiers that are getting butchered in Kursk, right, by Ukrainians that possess superior military equipment and technology, superior intelligence. Another thing to say about the Russian military situation, the soldiers are fighting because they get a decent salary, right? Most of them, some of them know they're going to die, but some of them at least think, well, that pension will go to my family, you know, if indeed the promises are kept. So situation with the soldiers, that is, there's every inducement to have soldiers fight the war, so they're paid well, at least they're promised that they'll be paid well. Putin doesn't have many suitable and allies to fight the war, other than, you know, North Korea, India, and Venezuela, I think. Right? So what's going to happen? Is Putin going to come to the negotiating table with Trump? If he does, he will be forced to negotiate. I say that because Putin does not want the war to end until he wins. At least in his opinion, he can say he won the war, right? What happens if there were reconciliation and the war were to end soon? I think Putin would be thrown out of office. He might even be murdered by his own people, right? He would be saddled with this mammoth task of facing a crippled, a dying Russian economy that's going to take decades to repair. Literally mean decades, because there's going to be reluctance for any Western nation to help Russians out because of what Putin has done, right? So he's not in any position of strength when he comes to the bargaining table, as many Westerners keep saying. Well, he's got these lands that he's occupied. Ukraine's in no position to bargain. Ukraine's in a remarkably strong bargaining position, as far as I'm concerned, right? Now, for Putin, the end will be worth the efforts of hundreds of thousands if he can somehow save face and claim, the Donbass and parts of southern Ukraine, Crimea as Russian space. Somehow, if that works out, he can save face and say, yeah, in spite of the fact that we've lost over 1 million soldiers or something like that, it'll probably be well over 1 million in time. You can say, yeah, but we've regained land that is ours. We've got this land, this farmland we've regained. We've only lost 1 million people trying to get it, but we got it back. Now we need to get. And the problem with negotiating with Putin is that we know deep down he wants all the lands that the Soviet Union had. these were all parts of Russia at one point. We want Estonia, Lithuania, Latvia, Poland, and so forth. We want the Islamic nations that were formerly part of Ukraine to be formerly part of the USSR to be part of Russia once again. And he is insistent, right? If he's successful in Ukraine, he's going to Belarus and then Poland and all the other stuff if he's not. The idea is you have to confront him now, right? We need to confront him now. And I think Trump is the person to do it. As much as I dislike the unbridled narcissism of the man, he is a strong figure, and you can only meet Putin, who respects strength, with equal strength. And I think what Trump brings to the table is greater strength, right? The United States has resources Russia fails to have. Russia, by its inability to conduct this operation with Ukraine, has shown itself to be not a strong army at all. It's an embarrassment, and Putin somehow has to save face. He doesn't want the war to end because he's afraid of facing the economic problems. And he knows about them clearly. Now, what about Ukraine? Ukraine will at some point join NATO, probably sooner than 20 years that Trump has proposed. I think when Putin is dead or thrown out of office, things will change, hopefully change remarkably for Ukraine and Ukrainians. They will become part of NATO, and they will become a great and a very productive partner of the Union of European Nations. Ukraine is a rich country. It has natural resources, manganese ore, iron ore, coal, oil, natural gas, uranium. It has its chernozem, it's thick, rich black soil, very deep soil, capable of storing enormous amounts of moisture with all the nutrients for growing wheat, corn, barley, rapeseed, sunflowers, right, and the like. It can feed a lot of the known world when it's not impeded in what it wants to do. I went in with some thoughts, and I read this from my chapters. There can be no long-living military dictatorship in the 21st century. Dictatorships are not only out of vogue, but they are also by their nature unstable and unsustainable, especially in a world swelling with people, many of whom, unlike North Koreans, are actively involved with the internet and its sources of media. China, even with its cool partnership with Russia, seems to grasp that, yet it may take a third world war, finally, to ingrain us in that lesson. In a word, there is in today's world very little room for gray zones, for borderlands, for nations that are not yet dead. Thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoyed it. Please like and please share this with others if you did. See you again. We'll do this again at some point.